All right, thank you for joining us this morning for the Ancient Creeds class. For you guys who have just discussed, keep in mind where you first heard the Apostles' or Nicene Creed, because that is particular to probably every single person in this room, the first time that you heard or saw or perhaps said it. For my own personal self, the first time that I ever encountered or actually said the Apostles' Creed was in a church service when I was growing up. And over at FBC Bologna, just about 45 minutes that direction. What's really interesting, though, is that the context in which that creed came up was actually a Christmas service. Some of you guys might know that I used to lead music in the worship service for our church over at FBC. And one of the interesting things about the creed and what we said was we said the Apostles' Creed. So the Apostles' Creed, the one that we use in morning prayer. And the modern translation of the Apostles' Creed is what we used. But can anybody guess as to which word was changed? There was one word that was changed in the creed. Can you guess which word it was?
In the Greek?
In English. So at FBC, when we said the creed, there was one word that was changed. Can anybody guess what that word was?
Catholic.
There we go. Bingo. The word Catholic was changed. And it was changed to universal. Can anybody guess what the word Catholic means? Universal. So, all I want to say is that think about the contextualization of that. So, the reason why we have to ask where and when we sometimes encounter creeds is that linguistically, certain things carry a freight of meaning that we sometimes don't have in other contexts. And specifically within wider Protestantism in the United States, whenever you say the word Catholic, you associate Roman Catholic.
Right.
But the thing is that the word Catholic has a far more ancient use. And we're going to encounter a little bit of what that is going to be here in just a minute. Did you want to say something, Jan?
Yeah, I changed my answer because it's the AME church that I first said it.
Oh,
because I questioned that.
Yeah.
I got an opportunity to talk to the preacher one, but I'm like, why are we saying that, or why do y'all say that you support the Roman Catholic, or whatever the phrase is.
Yeah.
And that that's the first time I was explained the universal idea. And he said that their intent had never been to separate from the church, and they would want to be unified again.
Yeah.
And that's part of the prayer. That was the explanation he gave.
Very good. Well, and so you encountered a contextualized thing in which was explained that the reason why we confess one holy Catholic apostolic church is because, and this is something that I like to kind of emphasize to people, all expressions of the church claim Catholicity. We just don't say it in the same way. All expressions of the church claim part of the one universal church. The thing is that word Catholic carries with it, again, a freight of meaning within our current context that is not exactly where it originally originated from. And so when we ask when and where, we're asking ourselves what kinds of linguistic meanings are we getting within the translation of the creed, right? Because when we start talking about when, we have to start talking about something completely differently, contextually, to where we are right now. And as I heard in a comment from one of my friends online last time, I am going to try to slow my cadence a little bit. I was a little too quick speaking last time. I was going a little too fast. So I'm going to try to slow down a little bit because these are really important. So the when question. So when we ask when do the creeds occur? Just like we talked about last time about the who is a really complicated question to ask about the creeds, the when is a part of that complication. Because if we want to talk officially, so to speak, when do we officially have the creeds? The answer to that is two answers. Number one, the council at Nicaea convened in 325 Common Era. I'm going to be using CE because that's the way that modern academia refers to these things. And the council at Constantinople in 381. Now, here's the funny thing about the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. The Apostles' Creed most closely corresponds to Nicaea, and the Nicene Creed that we have today most closely corresponds to the Council at Constantinople. Now, the reason why this is a really important but interesting fact of history. What we have to get into is, what exactly did the councils do when they convened, when they met? And the reason why we have to be specific about this is because there are particular things that are forming the discussions that the council has. Now, the council at Nicaea is the first one that we need to talk about, because this is called the first ecumenical council of the church. And the reason why it's called the first ecumenical council of the church is because this one meeting had no fewer than 360 bishops from all parts of the world that were called in to convene and were called in to basically deal with a specific issue. Emperor Constantine calls this council because of the Arian controversy. We're going to talk about that when we get to the theological stuff. But the reason why this is convened is because there is such a sharp disagreement between the part of the church that believed that Jesus was not created, but co-equal with the Father, and the part of the church that believed that Jesus was the first and greatest creation, such as what Arius would say, and the adopted Son of God, and that these two rival distinctions right here threatened the cohesiveness of the church, but also underneath the table also threatened the cohesion of the Holy Roman Empire, which we would call that here in a couple hundred years. But one of the things is that when Constantine calls this council, we need to also understand that, like I said last time, Constantine calls the council, and Constantine, in letters that he wrote during and after the council, makes it very clear that Constantine thinks that Arius's position falls within the lines of orthodoxy. And so Constantine, especially as it comes to the representation that we have at the council, had every reason to believe that the Arian position was going to actually take the day. What actually happened, very interestingly enough, was that Athanasius' position took the day, Athanasius of Alexandria, which is that Christ is co-equal with the Father. The reason why this is important is because if you notice in the Apostles' Creed, one of the things that is said in the Apostles' Creed is, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. That's the only thing that's said about that in the Apostles' Creed. But what does the Nicene Creed say? We believe in Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made. Right? So we have an incredible elaboration on this because there is a specific issue going on. Now, here's what's interesting. During the Council of Nicaea, we have several formulations that are put on the floor, so to speak, that are debated and voted on. The person that we refer to most specifically is Eusebius. Eusebius is one of the early church historians that documents what happens at the council. Eusebius, it should be noted, records a formulation of the creed that is remarkably similar to the Nicene Creed, except that that creed terminates after I believe in the Holy Spirit. So, at the Council of Nicaea, you have a creed form that basically looks exactly like the Nicene Creed we say, but the rest of stuff after I believe in the Holy Spirit is dropped off. Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
Okay, so tell me one more time. I know you said this already. So, the Nicene, the accepted Eusebius one was God from God, light from light, true God, that they're basically equal. So what does the Arian one say?
So this is the thing, is that the the position of Arius is usually summed up in what we have is a little bit of a quote, a little bit of an easy-to-remember quote, which is, there was a time when he was not. Which basically means that there existed a point in time where Christ was not created yet. Now, this is an extant thing that we get in Athanasius' summation of Arius' position. So, historically, we have to be like, okay, this is Athanasius describing his rival's position. But at the same time, this is a fairly pointed. This is where the debate comes to, is that even if it was like, even if it was way, way, way before any creation, anything happened whatsoever, that basically it would be the point to where no one would have any knowledge of this except for God himself. And so the point of debate is Jesus fully God, or is Jesus a great creation of God? That it is nonetheless equal with God by adoption, but is not the same substance of the Father. If that rings a bell with some of the stuff. And if you'll hold off on questions until we get to the question time.
So does that mean there would not be a Trinity?
So that is what we'll talk about when we get to theological context. Okay. Yes. So hold that, because we're going to get into that a lot when we get into theological context. But that's where you have the when. But the thing is that the Apostles' Creed is the starting point where we start the Council of Nicaea at. The reason why we can say this is because the Apostles' Creed goes under another name in the early distinctions, and sometimes it's called the Symbolum Apostolorum, which is the symbol of the apostles. Now, that might sound like, oh, is it like a logo or something? What they're talking about is the symbol of the apostles is that formulation that you are baptized under when you join the church. Because the earliest creeds we have are baptismal formulas that people would say that they believe before they are baptized. So think about our baptismal service, where we have an interrogatory, where I ask people, do you believe in God the Father? And they recite basically the Apostles' Creed at the same time. I believe in God the Father Almighty. So the baptismal formulae of the creeds follows what's called the Apostolorum, or the Apostolorum Symbolum, which is the symbol of the apostles. And the Apostles' Creed, if you notice when you go through everything, is fairly generic when it comes to the big beliefs in the church. Again, Nicaea is the Nicene Creed, or the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, if you want to disambiguate that, is much more specific about certain things about Jesus. And that's the reason why that middle section of the Nicene Creed is so much bigger than we have in the Apostles' Creed. But we have a fairly good reason to believe that the Apostles' Creed was the starting point at which the clarifications at Nicaea begin to take root. Hence why we get Eusebius of Caesarea having a creed that is basically a halfway between the Apostles' Creed and the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed that we say in our main Sunday services, if that makes sense. So there is a creed that is a formulation that is generally agreed upon by most bishops in the council, basically. Now they're trying to get specific about this specific controversy, the Arian controversy, which we will talk about in a lot more detail when we get to those sections. But just have that in your mind. The council was called at a specific time for a specific disagreement. And when we say that, we have to remember that those formulations of the creed are going to reflect what those particular things are. But the proceedings at Nicaea, highlighting when the creeds, they deal with, again, what I like to put forward to you, the creeds didn't just come down from nowhere, nor did the Council of Nicaea make the creeds. Rather, what the council is doing is similar to what we did at Diocesan Convention a couple weeks ago, which is that there are things that we got to figure out and do, that we've got to come together and agree upon together so that we can move forward in the ways that we're already doing our stuff. And so the proceedings at Nicaea highlight what was already present in the geographic communities that met. And that means that there were some things that were remarkably common between everyone, such as, like I talked about last week, Justin Martyr's name for Christ was Jesus, the crucified under Pilate. In other words, that right there is a specific time claim. In other words, Jesus, in the time and space of us as humans, at a specific point in time, was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And he suffered death and was buried, and on the third day he rose again. All of that line right there was remarkably agreed upon by basically everybody. And the thing is that that's what we have in the Apostles' Creed. That's not something that was necessarily up for debate. Arius would not debate that. He believed that. The thing is the stuff that has to do with the nature of who Jesus is, or I should say, the substance of who Jesus is. But, again, these are something that are combined into a cumulative statement about what the churches around the earth at this point believed. And it culminates in the formulations of the creed, rather than the council simply stamping and saying, this is what Christians believe. Again, I want to highlight, Constantine, if he wanted to, could have laid the imperial hammer down and said, here's what you guys believe. He had the Arian position. And so the thing is that for the council to have taken the Athanasian position, rather than what the emperor himself held, shows that the creeds are a cumulative statement that is agreed upon by that council. We can disagree we can agree or disagree as to whether these tenets are necessarily on the table for us in modern day, but we have to go through the thing that says Nicaea didn't make the council, didn't make the creed, but rather the creed is a cumulative thing that is happening all around. Now, here's where we have to start playing the historical, we have to play the historical bouncing ball game, basically. So where did these things come from then? So where did they originate from? Well, here's where it gets hard. Again, we are pre-printing press in the when, right? Pre-printing press. Guess what? We don't have a lot of physical documentation in pre-printing press. In fact, there's someone who said, excuse me, got a little problem with me. There are historians that actually say it is no small coincidence that the Protestant Reformation caught on so quickly from Martin Luther, because Martin Luther lived just barely on this side of the printing press. His ideas could spread so much farther and wider than normally, because it was cheap to make books. You could get books into anybody's hands, and the common person could afford them. And so the thing is that you had these things getting distributed a whole lot of places. But guess what? This is 1,000 or 1,200 years before the printing press at this time. So when we're talking about where they came from, we have to also remember most Christian communities are small, they are not very wealthy in certain places, and the oral tradition is the main way that one passes on tradition. And so what happens, especially when you are not the legalized religion in Rome, is that it would not be wise to print public things that Rome can get a hold of and document you as saying you believe in the Son of God, who is this guy from Nazareth. Caesar says he's the Son of God. Does that mean that you're trying to cause trouble? Okay? So as it comes to culturally, they have to be a little bit closed-doored in this, because they don't know who's going to be listening. When the baptismal formulae are done, they're done in the catacombs, in the catacomb churches underground. They're meeting secretly to do this stuff. And therefore, what you profess in your baptism is also between you and the church in Christ. And so that formula is something that would have been passed on almost assuredly by mouth, not by text. So we have to remember we're appealing to the oral tradition as well when we get to this point. But what needs to be said is that the when is particular. We are dealing with specific questions of a specific time period. But that asks us where, right? So if we're dealing with when, now we have to ask, where did these things come from? Well, I talked to you about the idea that these creeds don't just come from nowhere. We have formulations that come from different places. Well, I'm just going to give you just a couple. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I want to point out how wide geographically these things occur. So, local creeds, or local baptismal formulations, followed, as best as we can see, what the Apostolorum Symbolum looks like, which is the Apostles' Creed, or at least a formula such as that. Valentinus of Rome, 138 to 160, writes about the baptismal formula that he received from the church in Rome. In fact, Valentinus and Justin Martyr, these guys right here, the dates right here are when they were in the cities that they were at. That's not when they died. But Valentinus would have been almost overlapping with Justin Martyr, whom Justin Martyr is one of our earliest attributations of Jesus as the crucified under Pilate, if you remember that. But the thing is that Justin Martyr primarily wrote in Palestine, though. So think about where Rome is. Geographically, if you think about the Mediterranean, Rome, and just think about Paul's journeys. How long did it take Paul to get to Rome? They had to sail to Crete. They had to sail, across the Mediterranean. Rome's way up here. Rome is in the southern part of Europe. Think about where Palestine is. Well, let me flip it. Down here. Way down here. Well, Tertullian writes in Carthage, North Africa, which is on the northern part of Africa, but not on the coast. He's actually in the northern section of Africa down here. But also think about Marcion, Pontus, which is in Asia on the eastern side. But Irenaeus is from Asia Minor. He's way on the eastern side, where Irenaeus is from. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out to you, and it should be given that Irenaeus is one of the best people that we have for what the Creed probably said. Irenaeus is sometimes referred to as Irenaeus the Great. He's one of the first great systematic theologians that we have in the church. But given Irenaeus' travels, we can trace that he probably learned his baptismal formula from Polycarp of Smyrna, which, by the way, we had Polycarp's commemoration last Wednesday. But Polycarp was one of the first bishops that was ordained within around the time period of the apostles. And so the thing is that Irenaeus likely received his baptismal formula by this oral tradition in his encounter with Polycarp, but also he spreads that baptismal formula at least to Gaul, which is Western Europe, and to Smyrna, which is in Turkey. And so, if you think about the geographic travels of all of these people, this is an incredibly wide place that we're dealing with. We're dealing with thousands of miles of where all of these communities are from. And as it comes to the where, why is it important to talk about the where? If you were to guess, how long would it take you to get to Little Rock if you went only by walking or by horseback? Anybody have an idea as to how long that would take you? So I ran. So how many?
3.
3. Okay. Any other guesses? There are a couple of different answers, but so the average human sprinter, travels between 17 to 25 miles an hour. So, and how long do Olympic sprinters sprint for? Not very long, right? Now, the average human jog, or the average human run, is anywhere between 5 to 15 miles an hour, depending on how in shape or how fast the pace you're setting. Michael can probably corroborate this because you run a lot, right? So the thing is that even at a jog, that's between 5 and 15. Walking speed, let me tell you what, you're not going too fast, right? Well, if you think about Little Rock as being, 45, 50 miles away, something like that. Imagine imagine the type of geographic area we're dealing with when we're dealing with where the creeds come from. And the thing is that as it comes to transportation, even communication, remember, this is way before the printing press. This is way before the average person was going to be sending letters. And if we think about the average person, they would be hiring people to make letters for them because a large portion of the populace, especially in the working classes of these regions, would very likely be able to speak the language, but not necessarily write. So the thing is that we have to think about the differences of how people would integrate with how communication happens, but also with how travel happens. Most people, especially as it comes to before the advent of modern transportation technology, you would have had no reason to go very far away from where you live, unless you're traveling to go somewhere else, or unless you're traveling to go see who you've not seen in a while. But the thing is that because we live in the ease of transportation that we have today, it's easy for us to travel long distances. But we have to remember how culturally diverse this geographic area was. And not even to say that it's culturally diverse, even if we do have transportation that doesn't take very long. But the thing is that we have places that are nigh untraveled by other places in the world. If you live way up in Southern Europe, you wouldn't have too much of a reason, unless you are going there for missionary purposes, should I say Irenaeus, right? You wouldn't have a big reason to go all the way to the Silk Road in Asia Minor, unless you were a traveling merchant or something like that. So the thing is that there's a lot less cultural exchange at this point in the world, but they were also linguistically diverse. We're dealing with people who speak different languages. We're dealing with people in Gaul who are speaking pre-modern Gaelic, basically. We're dealing with people in Syria who are speaking Syriac and writing in Syriac. Palestine, which is Greek and Hebrew and Latin. You have Africa, which you have all kinds of dialects of Cyrillic and things like that. A Coptic, basically, an Egyptian language that uses Greek letters and things like that. So not even a language that's spoken anymore, written anymore. You have all of these things together, and in the when the councils convene, you have all of these bishops who are representing these places. So if you can imagine the cultural and the linguistic and the geographic diversity of what happens at those councils, you can probably understand why they took about 6 months in order to get those proceedings done. Because you had to figure out how to get people on the same page, not just theologically, but also linguistically, and things like that. So, the reason why I want to highlight the when and the where is that, as opposed to perhaps the way that we encountered the creeds, we probably encountered the creeds in our own language, not too very far from where we hail from, at least as it comes in the modern sense. But we also inherited a theological tradition that was fairly clear, right? We didn't have to question what we meant by "I believe in the resurrection of the body." So we didn't have to clarify exactly what those words are meaning. Oh, are we talking about anastasis, or are we talking about something else? By the way, go and watch the Theology Thursday video for a discussion of that. But the thing is that we didn't have to get linguistically on the same page for that necessarily in the same way that these people did. And so the creeds are not a monolithic exercise. These are an incredibly diverse exercise that takes a long period of time of people getting together and trying to figure out and hammer out what exactly are we confessing as the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church known throughout the world. What can we confess to put ourselves in the shoes of one of the bishops? What are we confessing that I am taking back from the council of the church to my people, wherever they might be, and say, this is what we as the church have agreed upon throughout the world? That's what the exercise we're talking about when it comes to the creeds are. So when we talk about when did the creeds happen and where did the creeds happen, that is a really, really complex question. But it is an important thing that highlights some obvious things. The creeds don't come from nowhere, but are a cumulative exercise. They are put together based upon what was already in these churches, already being spread, and they were elaborations about specific points in those main confessions. In other words, the Apostles' Creed to the Nicene Creed. And that they were specifically particular involving beliefs about who Jesus is, which we will talk about next time as to the why the creeds. But questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Any questions that you guys thought about when we were coming up with this? And I'm monitoring the chat as well, so questions for those who are in the chat. What do you guys think? Oh, yeah, Jean?
What related to the dates, and I feel like I should know this, but I don't. What does the CE, what does that mean?
Yes, so in writing, within wider academia, Common Era and before Common Era. Basically, all of that does is, so instead of saying BC AD, it's basically CE BC. It's basically a shortened format, and it doesn't mean anything different. And as one person quipped, before Common Era, that implies that there is a common event that happens around that time, and we can kind of say that. But the other reason is that BC and AD, as it comes to academic writing, they actually are dealing with two different things. BC is a linguistic use of a different language, basically before Christ, but AD is in Latin, Anno Domini, and so you're basically dealing with English and Latin. And so, to make it more streamlined, the way that the Society of Biblical Literature talks about dates is using those terms. So it doesn't mean anything different. It's just a way to streamline that so that people, so that it doesn't deal with a couple of kind of different language issues. Yeah. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah. Go ahead, Josh.
So if we're to be as geographically diverse as it was, doesn't that imply, and if we're taking into account how long it would take to go from point A to point B? Doesn't that kind of imply that it was even earlier than those dates?
So
I mean,
yeah. So when let me go back to one of my slides. So
I think you said one.
Right here.
Yeah.
So this is where we get into the question of textual tradition versus oral tradition. So what you get at, Josh, is something that is almost certainly the case. It is almost certainly the case that the creeds originate far earlier than the earliest of 130. It is almost certainly the case that is what happens. The problem is that we don't have written textual ability to pin that to something either archaeologically or textually. So the thing is that we are almost certain that these creeds originate way earlier than 130. It's kind of like how the Muratorian fragment, which is the oldest physical evidence of the biblical manuscripts, is in the 120s, the Muratorian fragment of the Gospel of John. But we also can say that the Gospel of John basically is certainly written around 70 to 80, basically. And so the thing is that we have to use that language of basically, it is almost certain that this is the case, but we just don't have physical evidence to be able to say this is the case. But as it comes to the way that we look at these things critically, not simply in the historical critical, but also as it comes to the what is the most likely origin source of these things, this sucker right here is the big thing. Because we're dealing with communities that are not going to be using paper for everything that they do, they're going to be using particular constructions of oral tradition. And so the thing is that we even see this in the writing of the Bible. For you guys who've been through how to read the Bible, or in some of the New Testament studies that we've done here, you'll hear me say that this form right here looks like an oral tradition formula. So a good example of this, we're in the middle of the Sermon on the Plain by Jesus. If you look at the Beatitudes from Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, that has the definite imprint that this was an oral saying to begin with. This was something that was an oral thing. And obviously it's a sermon. You're saying this to people. So people are remembering this oral construction and then writing it down afterwards. That doesn't mean that Jesus never said it. That just means that the writing happened after the occurrence that it occurred. So it wasn't that you were sitting down and writing it down. But yeah, so Josh brings up an important point. It is almost certain that these occurred earlier. But the earliest textual hymn that we can drop in it is the earliest of 130s, and likely earlier because of oral tradition. Does that make sense to everybody? The way that I described that? Yeah, go ahead, Ginger.
Why was it important to have that creed? Who decided we needed to write this down and say?
Yeah, so we're going to get to the why question next week. Yeah, so the why is the big question, right? So why is it the case that we needed to have something that encompasses all of these things? And again, it gets back to the purpose that we talked about at Creed last week, right? So the Nicene Creed is an interesting tension between specificity and generality. It's an interesting tension between, to use different language, an interesting tension between what do we believe and what do we not believe. What do we all confess is the case, what do we not confess is the case. Now, what is important to note when we get to the why question next week, which we'll deal with this exactly, which is why do we need one in the first place? One of the things that we have to deal with is the tension between being able to say positively, what do we believe, and also to say negatively, we do not believe something. I'm going to bring up a creed next week that is called that I referenced last week. That is called the Athanasian Creed. If you want to read up on this beforehand, in your Book of Common Prayer, it's in the historical document section. So if you go back to the historical document section, there is something called the Athanasian Creed, in which the Athanasian Creed has we believe and we also do not believe this. So it has both of those things in it. However, I think it's important that the churches liturgically, so we're talking about worship now, we're going to get away from historically. Liturgically, we only use the forms that are the positive statements, right? We use the ones, we believe this, we believe this, we believe this. One of the important things about Anglicanism, and again, we're getting way back from this context, one of the important things about Anglicanism is that the creeds are one of the four things we say constitute the church. Not whether it's in your worship service or not, but whether you agree with the tenets of it. The tenets of the creeds deal with positive statements about certain necessary items. But the interpretation of Anglicanism also says there are things that are not in the creeds that are not necessary to believe, that we can have other opinions about that are not these things, basically. And so, to use Michael's language last week, it is a tension between inclusivity and exclusivity. It is, what are we saying is the case positively, but what are we also withholding judgment about, if that makes sense? It's just as dicey today as it was when they were at the councils. Again, there is that legendary story that we get every Christmas of St. Nicholas slapping Arius. That is a legend that comes out of the Council of Nicaea. We don't have any evidence that this actually happened, but the thing is that these were heated arguments. These were not just happy bishops sitting down together and just figuring stuff out. There was some intense disagreement at these councils. And so this was not something that was an easy process. It was... to kind of use Jesus' words, it was more of the birth pangs rather than the actual birth of something as it comes to the councils. It was a lot of the pain that we went through in order to get to where that is. But yes, the why is what we will get to all of next week. We will lay all that on the table next week. We are a little bit over time, but I just want to thank you guys so much for being a part of this. Next week we're dealing with the why. Why do we have this? And then we're going to launch into the actual creeds themselves and talk about the theological context. So, see you guys next week.